Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving right into a seriously debated economic case study, the agricultural subsidy model, and what you might call the illusion of ownership. To really wrap our heads around this, we actually need to kick things off with a very specific, sweeping political promise. Let's flash back to the 2019 presidential election. Sajid Premadasa made this massive promise to tea estate laborers. He told them he was going to transform them from workers into actual owners of the estates. It's exactly the kind of sweeping rhetoric that pops up all the time to win over massive blocks of voters during a major campaign cycle. Now, the analysis we're unpacking today, it doesn't mince words about this at all. It actually characterizes this promise as a fundamentally foolish idea, and notes that, economically speaking, it's a really good thing this specific proposal didn't happen. But here's the thing. We want to know why. Why exactly does the source look at this kind of instant ownership promise and see an economic disaster waiting to happen? Okay, let's dive into this. The most compelling argument the source makes against this promise isn't just some abstract theory. Has this exact concept, instantly turning laborers into landowners, actually been executed by politicians before? Well, it absolutely has. Not for tea, but for paddy cultivation. Yeah, this is not a new experiment at all. We're talking about massive historical land distribution programs. Back in the DS Senanayake era, spanning the 1940s and 50s, we saw the colossal Galoya scheme. And then later, in the 70s and 80s, the Mahaweli development project took center stage. In these initiatives, governments basically orchestrated the relocation of huge populations. They literally handed them agricultural lands to rapidly develop the nation's rice industry. It was this massive, state-sponsored attempt to engineer agricultural prosperity. But as you might guess, this grand vision slammed right into the reality of economics. The source argues that these mass distributions failed to create a thriving industry for one incredibly glaring reason. The missing element? A business plan. Think about it. Agriculture on a national scale is a highly complex business. It requires strict supply chain logistics, financial forecasting, and deep market analysis. Just handing out land to people with zero prior agribusiness knowledge? It didn't solve poverty. According to the text, it actually made the whole situation worse. To really understand why this failed, the source presents a pretty fascinating theory on economic structures. They argue that in literally any society, only a relatively small percentage of people actually possess a true entrepreneurship mindset, that specific combo of skills, risk tolerance, and strategic thinking you need to run a business. So society functions best when people without that specific skill set work within established businesses, or maybe structured cooperatives, rather than being forced to suddenly act as independent agribusiness CEOs. And this leads to a huge structural shift. By handing out all this land without any kind of business framework, these historical political moves essentially engineered a completely new demographic, the farmer class. This was a completely separate group existing entirely outside the traditional employer-employee dynamic. Literally overnight, hundreds of thousands of people were mandated to manage their own independent businesses without the necessary skill set. They were set up for a massive struggle right from day one. So, what happens when this massive, artificially created business sector starts failing? Well, politicians didn't address the root cause, that fundamental lack of a viable business model and entrepreneurial training. No, instead, they just started applying plasters to surface-level problems. They treated the symptoms, completely ignoring the underlying economic disease. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer scale of these plasters. It's honestly staggering. Farmers said fertilizer was too expensive. The government subsidized it. The state stepped in to maintain massive irrigation networks just to provide free water. Then you add on as with summa welfare, concessionary loans, endless political loan write-offs, and super aggressive market protections, like import taxes on foreign rice. All of this equates to a massive, ongoing financial burden, and it's paid directly by the rest of the country's taxpayers. Which, of course, leads us to a highly logical, almost unavoidable question. After extracting all the support from the broader tax base and successfully selling products at artificially inflated prices, completely shielded from competition, are the farmers rich? Has all this government support actually brought economic prosperity to this heavily subsidized group? Well, the answer provided by our source is a stark, tragic no. They remain the poorest group in the entire country. Despite the free water, the subsidized fertilizer, the protected markets, the system has entirely failed to lift them out of poverty. In fact, a massive portion of this demographic still heavily relies on aswasumma welfare programs just to survive. The plasters didn't fix the problem. They just institutionalized the poverty.
To really grasp the macroeconomic impact of this failure, we have to look at one absolutely critical number: 6%. Think about that. Despite the massive land usage, the constant political attention, and the incredibly heavy burden on the national taxpayer to keep this sector afloat, agriculture's total contribution to the national GDP is less than 6%.
To put that into perspective, picture the entire economic output of the whole nation. That tiny 6% sliver, that's agriculture. The overwhelming 94% of the economy, the sectors that are actually driving growth, driving innovation, and generating tax revenue, is carrying the weight of that tiny fraction, a fraction that requires constant, incredibly expensive government intervention just to survive.
Now, hold that 6% in your mind as we hit our next critical data point: 40%. This right here is the human cost. Approximately 40% of the country's entire workforce are farmers. Nearly half of the working population is tied up in a sector that fundamentally lacks a sustainable business model.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate systemic breakdown. You've got 40% of the workforce contributing just 6% to the GDP. It's a staggering economic disconnect. A massive portion of the population pours their labor, their entire lives, into a system that yields practically nothing for the broader economy. And why? Simply because they were thrust into a model without the systemic support or training they actually needed. So, if the economy is suffering and taxpayers are bleeding money to fund these subsidies and the farmers themselves remain totally trapped in poverty, you've got to ask, who is actually winning here? The source concludes with a really piercing assertion. The sole beneficiaries are the politicians, maintaining this massive dependent class of voters who constantly need subsidies and loan write-offs just to survive. That secures a huge, highly reliable base to leverage during every single election cycle. Which brings us to a final, highly provocative thought from our source. Who is actually going to step up and fix this deeply ingrained problem? Should the rest of the country continuously spend its hard-earned money to maintain a fundamentally flawed system? It's a heavy economic reality to ponder, for sure. Thank you for joining me for this explainer of the source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.